You're the royal physician of Spain. Madrid, 1834. The palace corridors echo with silence thick enough to strangle. Ferdinand VII, the king, is dead. But your work is far from over. A sealed summons drags you past the veils of mourning and into the late king's private chambers. An opulent tomb of silk, gold, and secrets too obscene for daylight. There, standing under heavy crimson drapes, soaked in grief, is the Queen Regent, Maria Cristina. Her face is streaked with tears, her lips trembling with a request that makes your pulse stop cold. She wants him preserved. Not for honor, not for history, for something much stranger. You nod. You can't refuse a queen, even when your instincts scream otherwise. As you approach the corpse of Ferdinand VII, the candlelight flickers across his face, stone cold and still twisted in the sneer of a man who ruled with cruelty and paranoia. But it's not his face that arrests your attention. It's what lies beneath the embroidered silk sheets. There, beneath the royal linen, lies a grotesque relic, a part of Ferdinand whispered about in shadowed corners of history, but never officially chronicled. A monstrosity that defined his reign as much as his betrayals or tyranny. The king's oversized, misshapen, and anatomically disturbing endowment. It is said to have been both his curse and his throne. An object of shame so unbearable it twisted his soul, yet a symbol of masculinity he clung to with cruel pride. You stare down at it now, not as a physician, but as a man trying to rationalize the irrational. And so, your hands begin their solemn, grim task. The preservation of flesh that defied logic and humiliated empires. You're not embalming just a body. You're preserving the legacy of deformity, a physical manifestation of a monarchy malformed by centuries of incest, power, and madness. Before we descend further into these horrific, unspoken chapters of Spanish history, I ask you to take a breath, and if you're drawn to these forbidden stories, consider liking and subscribing. Leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Together, from every corner of the world, we peel back history's veil and find the rot behind the crown. Now let us go back, much further, to the day Ferdinand was born. Ferdinand VII of Spain didn't arrive screaming into the world by accident. He was born as the inevitable conclusion of generations of royal bloodlines twisted into knots tied by political necessity and cemented with incest. October 14th, 1784. El Escorial Palace. A birth as ceremonial as it was cursed. He was the product of King Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins who had themselves been bred from cousins, uncles, and nieces. It was as if the Bourbon-Habsburg alliance had turned the Spanish royal line into a slow-moving biological disaster. The result? A child born with a soul split at the seam and a body that would become a medical riddle. Grotesque where it should be noble, monstrous where it should be proud. From the beginning, there were whispers. Midwives exchanged nervous glances. Palace doctors kept silent notes. Even in infancy, Ferdinand's anatomy was unnatural. What began as whispers about a bulky birthmark or peculiar formation quickly evolved into stunned silence. His genitalia, if it could even be described as such, defied medical knowledge. By adolescence, court physicians were already referring to him in Latin terms, borrowed from ancient texts describing mythical beasts. The king's future was not merely political, it was pathological. Contemporary accounts, buried deep in Vatican vaults and smuggled out centuries later, describe his anatomy in terms both clinical and terrifying. One physician wrote, "The prince bears an instrument most ungovernable in both size and shape, curved like a sickle, thick as a blacksmith's wrist, yet with a root as narrow as a quill. The deformity would render even the most sacred conjugal rites into an ordeal, bordering on surgical procedure." Another was less poetic, more blunt. "It is a weapon, not an organ." In an era where classical ideals reigned, and the male figure was modeled after smooth, balanced Greco-Roman statues, Ferdinand's condition was obscene. In private, courtiers laughed. Diplomats reported home with shock and dark humor. Servants whispered of the club, the snake, and the spiral. To them, it was a punchline. To Ferdinand, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Humiliation fermented into fury. His mind, already strained by inbreeding, bent further under the pressure of shame. He wasn't just mocked for being emotionally fragile or politically volatile. He was mocked for being fundamentally wrong, a freak. His parents didn't help. Charles IV, more interested in hunting than statecraft, was a weak man whose power ebbed away to his wife and her lover, Manuel Godoy, a commoner elevated to de facto ruler. Maria Luisa, meanwhile, was a sensualist with a taste for dominance. She openly flaunted her affairs. Young Ferdinand learned one lesson from his family. Betrayal was the heartbeat of royalty. He internalized that humiliation deeply. The court became a jungle of whispers. Behind every bow was a smirk. Every servant's lowered gaze masked laughter. Ferdinand knew. He watched, and he plotted. The child, cursed with a grotesque gift, began his transformation, not into a leader, but into a tyrant forged by shame. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. Paranoia overtook logic. Courtiers who so much as looked at him wrong were dismissed or vanished. A single incident, recorded in the journal of a frightened chaplain, encapsula Ted, the brewing horror. A young page, no older than 14, mistakenly entered Ferdinand's chamber while he was dressing. The boy saw it, that thing, and flinched. Ferdinand's response: the boy was flogged publicly, his family exiled to a remote province. The message: no one looks upon the king's shame and lives without punishment. This was the future monarch of Spain, a man defined not by vision or virtue, but by a biological burden so overwhelming it rewrote his personality. His trauma was no longer personal. It was policy. And as the years passed, his obsession with fixing his condition became the fuel for madness. By the time Ferdinand reached manhood, the secret was too large, literally and figuratively, to contain. His deformity wasn't just a private embarrassment anymore. It was a political liability. The palace physicians, caught between their oaths and their fear of royal wrath, began secretly documenting the anomaly. Among them was Dr. Francisco Flores, a brilliant but tormented man who left behind a series of encrypted letters later decoded in the dusty archives of Salamanca. In them, he described what no one else dared. His Majesty's member, he wrote, resembles an aberration of nature. Its length surpasses any known human anatomy, yet it is disfigured with bulbous protrusions and unnatural bends. The base is as thin as a thumb, the head swollen and veined, more akin to a club than a phallus. In arousal, it distorts further. There are growths along the shaft, soft tissue, medically useless, perhaps even parasitic. This was not an asset. It was a curse, a medical impossibility made flesh. And for a king, who would be judged by his virility, his heirs, his masculine legacy, it was catastrophic. The problem was twofold. Physically, it made intercourse dangerous, sometimes impossible. Psychologically, it made Ferdinand unstable. He turned to charlatans, snake oil mystics, foreign alchemists. They promised miracles, and he paid them in gold, rhinoceros horn powder, crushed pearls, dried tiger testicles, oriental elixirs with unreadable labels. He consumed them all like a man drowning, trying to drink the ocean. None of it worked. He became obsessed with finding the cure, not because he wanted relief, but because he believed his penis was his legacy, his identity, and his destiny. To fix it was to fix the monarchy. But instead of healing, he grew more paranoid. Every failure hardened him. When it came time to marry, the Spanish court arranged a union with his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, the daughter of Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies and Maria Carolina of Austria. She was 17, beautiful, and tragically unprepared. She had been raised on stories of courtly love, of gallant princes and romantic fates. She had heard Ferdinand called El Deseado, the desired one, by political propagandists. She expected a noble husband, not a man carrying a biological monstrosity. The wedding was a spectacle. Gilded arches, incense-filled cathedrals, and orchestras playing until dawn. But the real horror didn't begin until the celebration ended. The first sign of dread came in the form of a whisper. Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting. "Preparations are required," he said. He spoke of special cushions, ointments, mechanical supports. The women blinked, confused. They had never heard of such things, but they were told these were customs of Spanish royalty. That night, Maria Antonia stepped into the royal bedchamber as a lamb to slaughter. She expected shyness, perhaps awkwardness, but when Ferdinand disrobed, her scream echoed through the stone halls of the palace. One of her ladies later wrote in a secret journal, "Her Majesty began weeping and wailing as though Lucifer himself had appeared before her." She backed against the wall, calling it a monster, begging for God's protection. The thing she saw was not a phallus. It was a creature, veined, twisted, bloated at the tip, with lumps that pulsed as if alive. It swung like a grotesque pendulum from Ferdinand's waist, and when aroused, it expanded beyond human comprehension. Ferdinand said nothing. He had expected this. The physicians were summoned. The tools were brought in. Pillows to hold the member upright, ointments to lubricate and numb, even padded restraints to prevent unintentional injury. What followed was not lovemaking. It was a clinipan, cal ordeal, a ritual of flesh, blood, and royal obligation. Maria Antonia wept through it. Ferdinand remained cold, methodical. To the court, they were newlyweds. Behind the doors, they were prisoners in a medical tragedy. As months passed with no pregnancy, desperation crept in. Ferdinand, believing his wife's revulsion was sabotaging conception, turned cruel. He accused her of resisting God's will. He forced her into rituals timed by astrologers, making her wear fertility charms, and submit to nights of pain masked as duty. Her ladies began dosing her with laudanum to help her endure. Then more, then daily. Eventually, Maria Antonia couldn't function without it. She became pale, thin, and ghost-like, a teenage bride aging by the month. But when she did conceive, hope flared briefly in the Spanish court. Alas, both pregnancies ended in tragedy. The first miscarriage came in the 4th month, quietly and painfully. The second happened almost at term. It was violent, bloody, nearly fatal. Maria Antonia never recovered. By 21, she was hollow-eyed, addicted, and broken in spirit. She died in 1807. The court listed the cause as fever. The physicians privately said, heartbreak. Her soul had been carved out night after night by a man she feared more than death. Ferdinand did not grieve. He brooded. Within weeks, rumors spread. Did he kill her? Poison her? Did the palace apothecary, who also died mysteriously, leave behind a letter confessing to royal crimes? We will never know. The letter vanished. So did the truth. What didn't vanish was Ferdinand's obsession. He began searching for a new bride, not out of love, not out of duty, but to finish what had been denied, an heir. And this time, he would be prepared. New devices were ordered. Surgical instruments were imported. A physician from Prussia arrived under a false name. Ottoman midwives whispered of herbal surgeries that might reform the root. None succeeded. But they fed the king's delusions, that he could master his curse, and in doing so, master the throne itself. Ferdinand was no longer merely deformed. He was dangerous. Spain in the early 1800s was a land splintered by whispers of revolution, of French ambitions, of a king more obsessed with his monstrous anatomy than his crumbling empire. And Ferdinand VII, now a widower, was at the center of it all. But rather than turn outward, toward governance or reform, he descended deeper into a spiral of sexual obsession, political paranoia, and megalomania. His trauma had not just shaped him, it had devoured him. The palace staff saw it first, then his ministers, then his people. He demanded silence from everyone who had ever witnessed his deformity. That meant removing witnesses permanently. Valets who once bathed him, seamstresses who sewed specialized undergarments, physicians who made journal entries too detailed. All were exiled, imprisoned, or quietly executed. Ferdinand VII was not simply hiding his condition, he was erasing it from the world. But his fear could never outrun the truth. The deformity continued growing, pulsing, warping. One physician's hidden correspondence, found years later beneath the floorboards of a Madrid apothecary shop, described it in grotesque detail. His Majesty's organ now features growths of fleshy protrusions at irregular intervals, making the act of intercourse even with aid devices perilous. We suspect a hormonal aberration, perhaps a pituitary disturbance or chronic lymphatic swelling, yet he refuses intervention. Ferdinand refused intervention because to be changed was to admit defeat. He had begun to believe the deformity was not a curse, but a sign, divine, infernal, or otherwise. Some days he would weep before it, praying aloud. Other days, he ordered mirrors placed around his chamber so he could watch it from all angles, speaking to it as one might a lover or rival. And always, he planned for the next wife. In 1816, he married Maria Isabel of Braganza, another cousin in the Habsburg Bourbon carousel, dynastic inbreeding. She was just 19, delicate in frame and hopeful in spirit. But no hope could survive the first night. The same preparations were made, the same aids retrieved. But the outcome was even worse than before. Witnesses heard screams, piercing and sustained. One servant confessed later that she thought an animal had broken into the queen's chambers. The next morning, the sheets were blood-stained, the furniture broken, and the queen mute with shock. Maria Isabel never spoke of that night. She simply changed. She developed a stutter, She refused to eat solid food. Her hands trembled constantly, and she began sleepwalking through the palace gardens, barefoot and pale, mumbling prayers to the Virgin. When a lady-in-waiting asked what had happened, Maria Isabel whispered, "It's not a man, it's a curse." Ferdinand, infuriated by her revulsion, declared her weak. He told his priests she lacked piety, and told his physicians she lacked endurance. Then he did what he always did. He escalated. He ordered restraints to be crafted, not just marital aids now, but leather bindings, shackles, padded devices designed to hold Maria Isabel in place during intimacy. The artisans who built them had once made royal saddles and hunting gear. Now they made instruments of violation. Still, she did not conceive. Still, he blamed her. Then came the phantom pregnancies. Perhaps they were psychological. The mind trying to create hope where there was only fear. Perhaps they were a trick of hormones or of divine cruelty. But for months at a time, Maria Isabel would swell, crave odd foods, vomit at dawn, and speak of the child within her. Ferdinand would rejoice. He'd summon ministers, commission cradles, write letters to foreign courts declaring Spain's salvation. But each time, the truth returned. No child, no heir, no hope. Maria Isabel deteriorated rapidly. By 1818, she weighed less than 90 pounds. The sparkle in her eyes had vanished. The stutter became silence. Then came the convulsions, the seizures. Her organs were shutting down. The court declared it nervous exhaustion. The truth, whispered behind gloved hands, was that she had died from despair, or worse, had hastened her death. Her last words, spoken to her confessor, were simply, "Thank you. I'm free now." Ferdinand did not mourn, not publicly, not sincerely. Instead, he ordered, her body embalmed with rare oils, entombed in the most opulent crypt money could build. And then, he immediately began seeking another bride. This time, he turned his eye toward a political match, one that could stabilize the Bourbon crown, one that might mask his growing madness beneath a cloak of diplomacy. But inside, he was already unraveling. Ferdinand's palace had become a labyrinth of hidden corridors, secret rooms, and mirrors, angled to catch every whisper. He began compiling enemy lists, servants, courtiers, priests, anyone who had ever smirked in his presence or dared speak his name after dark. His paranoia metastasized into policy. He created a private chamber beneath the palace, accessible only by him and a pair of loyal guards. There, he stored his most personal tools. Cushions with indentations, shaped to his grotesque form, custom-forged metal rods, surgical oils, and salves from the East, some designed to numb, others to harden. He believed that if he could perfect his body, he could perfect the crown, that Spain's destiny lay not in reforms or alliances, but in the unnatural length of his cursed anatomy and his obsession with legacy. He had failed to sire an heir, failed to connect as a husband, but he believed himself chosen by fate. Fate through deformity. The clergy had begun whispering it too, not in sermons, but in confessionals and letters sealed with wax, that perhaps Ferdinand's form was a punishment, a sign that divine order had been broken by centuries of incest, betrayal, and indulgence, and that perhaps it was too late to reverse it. Spain's colonies were burning, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, all rising in rebellion. But Ferdinand sat in his chambers, surrounded by oils and astrology charts, muttering prayers to saints whose eyes were painted shut. The empire cracked, and the king measured himself in candlelight. Ferdinand VII of Spain, was no longer merely a ruler. He had become a shrine to obsession, a symbol of dynastic rot, and a walking testament to how the sins of blood can manifest, not just in politics, but in flesh.